Welcome. Tonight, we embark on a journey that bridges two worlds we thought we knew. We will travel back to the age of the dinosaurs, to a time of giants that ruled the earth. But this is not a story about their end. It is a story about their transformation. It is the story of how a lineage of fierce, ground-dwelling predators over millions of years achieved the impossible. They unlocked the sky. This is the mystery of how dinosaurs became birds. We will explore everything from the first baffling appearance of a simple hair-like feather on a creature that should have had scales, to the slow step-by-step re-engineering of an entire body, until a creature that was born to hunt in the shadows of a forest was finally ready to take flight. And we will discover how this transformation gave them the one crucial key they needed to survive the apocalypse that claimed all their giant cousins, allowing them to thrive, to flourish, and to become the dinosaurs that we still see every single day in our own backyards. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you close your eyes and picture a dinosaur, what do you see? Perhaps you see the colossal building-sized form of a brachiosaurus, its long neck stretching slowly towards the treetops. Perhaps you see the great, armored tank of a triceratops, its head down, ready to charge. Or perhaps you see the king of them all, the Tyrannosaurus rex, its skin a tough, leathery, reptilian green or brown, letting out a thunderous roar. These are the images we have all grown up with. They are the images of a lost world of giant, magnificent, and scaly monsters. And for a very long time, this was the entire story. A grand and terrible dynasty that ruled for 150 million years, and was then suddenly, violently wiped from the face of the earth. But what if that story is wrong? Not wrong in its details, but wrong in its ending. What if the dinosaurs never truly left? To find the answer, we must set aside these familiar images. We must travel to the lush, fern-covered forests of the late Jurassic period, and we must ignore the giants. Instead, we must look to the shadows of the forest floor, to a very different kind of dinosaur. A creature that was small, fast, agile, and covered, not in scales, but in something new, something soft, something revolutionary. This is the beginning of a detective story, a story whose clues are written in the faintest, most delicate impressions in stone. It is the story of a predator learning to fly. It is the story of how scales became feathers, how arms became wings, and how a terrible roar was eventually transformed into a simple, gentle song. The image of the dinosaur that lives in our collective imagination is a powerful one. It is an icon of prehistoric power, a symbol of a world that was larger, more brutal, and more primal than our own. And for the better part of a century, that image was built almost entirely from scales. When the first great dinosaur skeletons were unearthed and assembled in the grand halls of 19th and early 20th century museums, scientists had to make an educated guess about what covered them. They looked at these magnificent reptilian skeletons, and they looked at the modern reptiles they knew, the crocodiles, the lizards, the snakes. The conclusion was simple, logical, and immediate. Dinosaurs were, quite simply, giant reptiles. And reptiles, everyone knew, were scaly. And so the illustrators and the painters of the time brought these creatures to life in that image. They were painted in dull, drab, reptilian colors, swampy greens, muddy browns, and dusty grays. Their skin was thick, leathery, and pebbled, like that of a crocodile. They were depicted as slow, cold-blooded, and lumbering creatures of brute force, rather than agility, their tails dragging heavily on the ground. This was the great classical age of dinosaur imagery, an image that was cemented in our minds by movies, by books, and by museum murals. It was an image of magnificent, but ultimately primitive, scaly monsters. And this image, for a very long time, was not wrong. It was just incomplete. It was incomplete first, because we now know that dinosaurs were not the slow, cold-blooded, tail-dragging beasts of these early paintings. We know that they were dynamic, fast, and active creatures. We know that many of them held their tails aloft for balance. We know that they were likely warm-blooded, or at least had a metabolism that was far closer to a modern bird or mammal than to a modern lizard. But it was also incomplete for a much more profound reason, a reason that would, just a few decades ago, shatter this classical image forever. The problem was one of preservation. Fossils are a miracle, and the fossilization of a hard, sturdy bone is a miracle enough. The preservation of the soft parts of a creature, its skin, its organs, its feathers, is a miracle of an entirely different order. It requires a set of perfect, impossible circumstances, a death in a place with no oxygen, and a burial by the finest, gentlest mud, a mud that can capture the impression of a single delicate fiber. For over 100 years, we simply did not have those fossils. We had the bones, and the bones told us a story of size and shape, but they were silent on the question of skin. And so we built our scaly giants. We built our T-Rex as a leathery brute, our velociraptor as a naked, lizard-like hunter. This image became so ingrained, so correct in our minds that we almost stopped questioning it. The dinosaurs were reptiles, and reptiles had scales. The case, it seemed, was closed. But all the while, hidden in the fine-grained rocks of ancient lakebeds, a new set of fossils was waiting. A new library was waiting to be discovered, one that would, with the faintest, most delicate impressions, tear down that old, scaly image forever. The real story was not one of scales, it was one of feathers. But to understand which dinosaurs wore them, we must first understand the great dinosaur family, and the one specific branch that would eventually learn to fly. The word dinosaur itself can be a bit of a trap. It is a single powerful word that we use to describe a reign of 150 million years, a reign that included thousands of different species, from creatures the size of a chicken to titans the size of a building. To simply group them all together as dinosaurs is like looking at the modern world and saying mammals, a word that includes both a tiny field mouse and a great blue whale. The reality of the dinosaur world was far more complex, more diverse, and more beautifully organized. To find our way to the birds, we must first learn how to read the great dinosaur family tree. When paleontologists first began to organize the growing collection of these magnificent fossils, they looked for a simple, fundamental way to divide them into their great founding families. They didn't look at their diet, whether they ate meat or plants. They didn't look at their size, they looked at their hips. It was a brilliant piece of 19th century insight by a scientist named Harry Seeley. He noticed that, despite their incredible diversity, all dinosaurs seemed to possess one of two basic hip structures, a design that was a clear evolutionary fork in the road. The first group he named the Ornithischia, which means bird-hipped. This is a confusing name, and we will return to it, because in one of life's greatest ironies, the bird-hipped dinosaurs are not the ones that led to birds. This group had a pubic bone that pointed backwards, towards the tail, much like a modern bird's. This was the family of the great plant eaters, the armored and the horned. This was the family of Triceratops, Stegosaurus, and the great duck-billed hadrosaurs. They were a vast, successful, and magnificent dynasty. But they are not part of our story tonight. Theirs is a different journey. The second group he named the Saurischia, which means lizard-hipped. In these dinosaurs, the pubic bone pointed forwards, like that of a modern lizard. And this great family, this lizard-hipped dynasty, was itself split into two legendary branches. The first branch was the sauropods. These were the giants of the giants, the quadrupedal, long-necked plant-eaters whose very footsteps would have shaken the Jurassic Earth. This was the branch of Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus, the largest creatures to ever walk the land. The second branch was the one that matters for our journey. They were the other side of the lizard-hipped family. They were bipedal, meaning they walked on two legs. They were fast, they were agile, and they were, with very few exceptions, the hunters. This was the branch of the theropods. This single word, theropod, meaning beast-footed, is the key. It is the golden thread that will lead us all the way from the age of giants to the bird feeder in your garden. This one group is the protagonist of our entire story. It is the family that includes the colossal Tyrannosaurus rex. It includes the swift Allosaurus. And it includes the smaller, more nimble, and more intelligent hunters of the forest floor, the raptors. It is here, within this single, dynamic, and deadly branch of the dinosaur family tree, that our true story begins. We must now leave the giants of the family behind and focus our gaze on the smaller, quicker, and warm-blooded members of this clan, the creatures that were, even then, unwittingly taking the first, crucial steps on the long road to the sky. So let us begin our journey here with this one remarkable family, the theropods. The name itself, Theropoda, means beast-footed. It's a name that evokes the power and predatory nature of this incredible dynasty. If you were to see a classic three-toed dinosaur track pressed into the ancient mud of a Jurassic riverbank, you are almost certainly looking at the footprint of a theropod. It is the iconic three-clawed mark of the rulers of the Mesozoic. But their defining feature, the evolutionary choice that would set them on a path to an entirely different destiny, was their posture. They were, almost without exception, bipedal. They walked the earth on two strong, powerful hind legs, their bodies held in a horizontal balance with a long, muscular tail stretching out behind them. And this simple fact, this commitment to walking on two legs, had a profound and world-changing consequence. It freed their arms. While their great, lizard-hipped sauropod cousins had to use their front limbs as massive, column-like legs to support their immense weight, the theropod was free to do other things with its hands. Free to grasp, free to hold, free to slash, and to tear. And one distant day, free to do something truly magnificent with them. This was a family of incredible range and success, a dynasty that ruled the land for over 150 million years. It included the great hunters of the Jurassic, like Allosaurus, a perfect 15-foot-long predator. It included strange, river-dwelling giants like Spinosaurus, with its immense, sail-like back. And of course it included the most famous predator that has ever lived, the great Tyrannosaurus rex, the apex hunter of its time. But for our story, these colossal, multi-ton giants are not the protagonists. They are the famous cousins, the successful, heavy-hitting branch of the family. The real transformation, the delicate and revolutionary magic, was happening in the shadows of these giants, among the smaller, more graceful, and more nimble members of the clan. We must turn our gaze to a specific, wondrous, and far more bird-like subgroup of theropods. A group that paleontologists call the Maniraptora. The name means hand snatchers. These were the smaller, more slender, and quite possibly more intelligent theropods. This was the family of the raptors, of Velociraptor and Deinonychus, creatures that were not built for brute force, but for speed, agility, and a terrifying, grasping precision. Their lives were a constant, high-speed chase, a world of pouncing and leaping and balancing. It was here, In this family of fast, likely warm-blooded and incredibly active hunters that the evolutionary pressures of the forest floor were the most intense. It was here that the body was being pushed to new limits. And it was here, within this group of hand snatchers, that the long, strange, and beautiful journey to the sky would truly begin with a single, humble, and revolutionary new structure. So let us set our scene. Let us plant our feet firmly in the world that our heroes, the Maniraptors, inherited. We are in the late Jurassic period, roughly 150 million years ago. This is not the steaming, misty, supercharged world of the Carboniferous swamps. The air is thinner now, the climate more familiar, but nor is it the world of today. It is a world without a single blade of grass, a world without a single flower. There are no great, broad-leafed oak trees or maples. It is a world of a different kind of green. The climate across much of the planet is warm, humid, and remarkably stable. The great supercontinent of Pangaea is in the process of breaking apart, allowing shallow, warm seas to spread inland and creating a global greenhouse effect. The poles are free of ice. The air is soft and damp. The dominant plants of this world are evergreens, great, primeval forests of conifers, like the Araucaria and the redwood, tower into the sky. But the undergrowth, the world of the forest floor, is where the true strangeness lies. There is no grass. Instead, the ground is covered by a lush, thick and endless carpet of ferns, some as tall as a person. And scattered everywhere are the strange, stout, palm-like trees called cycads and the ancient, fan-leafed ginkgo. It is a world of green, but a muted, ancient and alien shade of green. And this world, this warm, fern-filled world, is the kingdom of the giants. This is the golden age of the sauropods. The colossal, long-necked Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus move in great, earth-shaking herds, their heads browsing the tops of the conifer trees. And hunting them are the great theropod predators, the terrifying three-clawed Allosaurus. This is the world of the Titans. But our story, the story of the journey to the sky, is not happening among these giants. It is happening in the spaces they leave behind. It is happening in the deep undergrowth, in the shadows of the forest floor, a world of small, fast, and desperate opportunities. Here, in this fern-covered world, our heroes, the small, bipedal Maniraptors, are making their living. They are creatures perhaps the size of a turkey or a wolf, and their lives are a constant, high-speed chase. They are hunting the other, smaller inhabitants of this world, the quick, darting lizards, the large, buzzing insects, and the first small, fur-covered mammals that scurry in the darkness. This is not a life of brute strength. It is a life of agility. It is a life of leaping, of pouncing, of sudden, lightning-fast bursts of speed. It is a world where being fast on your feet, being able to twist and turn in an instant, and being light enough to launch yourself at your prey is the absolute key to survival. And as we picture them now, in this Jurassic forest, we see them as they have always been imagined, quick, intelligent, and covered from head to toe in the fine reptilian scales of their ancestors. But this high-speed, high-energy lifestyle, in a world that for all its warmth still grew cool in the night, was creating a new and invisible evolutionary problem. A problem of energy, a problem of heat. And in solving this problem, this humble, ground-dwelling hunter was about to stumble upon the single most important invention on the long, winding road to the sky. This high-speed, high-agility lifestyle of the Maniraptors, this world of constant, frantic action, implies something profound about their biology. It implies a different kind of engine. A modern, cold-blooded reptile, like a crocodile or a lizard, is a master of patience and efficiency. It can lie perfectly still for a day, for a week, its metabolism slowed to a crawl, waiting for a single, opportune moment. It draws its heat directly from the sun, and when the sun goes down, its internal engine cools and quiets. But the life of a small theropod was not like this. Its very anatomy, that of a fast bipedal hunter, speaks of a life of constant motion. It was not waiting for the sun to warm it up. It was generating its own internal roaring furnace. It was an endotherm. It was warm-blooded. A warm-blooded engine is a powerful advantage. It gives an animal endurance. It gives it the ability to hunt in the cool of the night, to be active when its cold-blooded neighbors are sluggish and vulnerable. It is the engine of a high-performance predator. But this engine, this internal furnace, comes with a terrible, unyielding cost: inefficiency. It is a fire that must be constantly fed. And for a creature that is small, this problem becomes a crisis. Physics is a cruel master. The smaller an object is, the faster it loses its heat. A tiny cup of coffee will grow cold in just a few minutes, while a large insulated thermos can stay warm for hours. The small maniraptor, perhaps the size of a turkey, was a tiny walking cup of coffee, desperately trying to stay warm in a world that was constantly stealing its precious, hard-won heat. This created a terrible evolutionary paradox. The creature had to spend an enormous amount of energy every single day hunting and eating just to generate the heat that it was immediately losing to the cooler, surrounding air. And the skin it was wearing was a complete and total failure. Scales, the traditional reptilian body covering, are a disaster for insulation. They are like a suit of armor, yes. They are durable and they protect from scrapes and scuffs, but they are not a blanket. They offer almost no protection from the cold. A small, scaly, warm-blooded creature would be an evolutionary failure, an engine with no insulation, a creature so inefficient it would have to eat 24 hours a day just to break even. This was the great problem of the small theropods. They had a high-performance, warm-blooded engine, but they were trapped in a body that was hopelessly, tragically uninsulated. They were losing a war against physics. They needed a new kind of skin. They needed a revolution. And for more than 100 years, scientists had no idea that the evidence for this revolution was waiting in perfect silence within the rocks. For over a century, the scaly reptilian dinosaur was the undisputed truth. It was an image built on logic, on comparison, and on a fossil record that seemed to confirm it. But this entire time, the fossil record was hiding a secret. The problem was not that we were wrong, it was that we had not yet found the fossils that could tell the whole story. That all changed in the 1990s. In a series of quiet, dusty quarries in northeastern China, in a province called Liaoning, paleontologists began to unearth one of the most important fossil beds, or Lagerstätten, ever discovered. These were not the jumbled, weather-beaten bones of a riverbed. This was the fine, silken and undisturbed ash of an ancient volcanic eruption, an event that had settled gently over a pristine, quiet lake. This ash had buried the creatures of that lake and its shores instantly in a fine-grained, oxygen-poor tomb that was perfect for preserving the impossible. It was a place that did not just preserve bone, it preserved the faint, ghostly whispers of soft tissue. And in 1996, a fossil was uncovered that would, in a single stroke, shatter the old, scaly image of the dinosaurs forever. It was a small, graceful theropod, about the size of a turkey. Its skeleton was perfect, its small, sharp teeth and long, balancing tail clearly marking it as a member of the Maniraptoran family. But it was not the bones that stunned the scientific world into silence. It was what surrounded the bones. Encasing the entire skeleton from the tip of its nose to the end of its long tail was a dark, unmistakable halo. A fuzzy, carbonized shadow. This was not the impression of scales. It was the impression of a coat. The creature had been covered in a thick, dense and primitive down. Scientists, in their excitement, nicknamed it Dino Fuzz. These were not complex, modern feathers. They were simple, short, hair-like, branching filaments. But they were, undeniably, feathers. The creature was named Sinosauropteryx, the Chinese dragon wing, and it was a smoking gun. Here, in this 125-million-year-old slice of stone, was the definitive proof. This was the solution to the great warm-blooded problem. This was the insulation. This was the blanket that the small theropods had so desperately needed to protect their high-energy engines from the cold. It was a revelation that sent a shockwave through the world of paleontology. The old, leathery, green-skinned velociraptor of movies and murals was dead. A new, more accurate, and far stranger image was rising to take its place. An image of a creature that was not a giant, scaly lizard, but a fast, agile, and fluffy bird-like predator. The revolution had begun, and this simple, fuzzy filament was just the very first step. The discovery of that fine, fuzzy halo on Sinosauropteryx was a landmark. It was the definitive proof that the story of dinosaurs was not one of scales alone, but it also opened a new and even deeper mystery. How do you get a feather? These two structures, a hard, flat, reptilian scale and a soft, complex, branching feather, seem to be biological opposites. One is a simple, protective tile. The other is a complex natural work of art, an intricate structure of barbs and barbules, a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. How could one possibly have evolved from the other? The answer, it turns in, is that a feather is not the opposite of a scale. It is a cousin, and an incredibly ambitious one at that. For a very long time, scientists were baffled by this. But we now know that both scales and feathers, and even our own human hair, all begin their lives in the same exact way. They all start as a tiny specialized cluster of cells in the skin, a little thickening of the epidermis that we call a placode. This is the basic genetic kit. It is the starting block. From this same starting block, life has three basic options. Option 1, the reptilian option, is to have this placode grow flat. It grows and hardens into a simple, overlapping fold of skin. A tile. This is a scale. It is strong, it is durable, and it is a wonderful suit of armor. But the ancestors of the dinosaurs stumbled upon a second option. What if that placode, that little cluster of cells, didn't grow flat? What if instead it grew long and hollow? This, we believe, was the very first step, a simple revolutionary mutation. The scales on the body of a small theropod, instead of lying flat, began to grow into tiny, hollow, conical straws. These were the stage 1 feathers, simple, unbranched keratin tubes. They were not for flight, they were not even for insulation, they were just there. But from this simple, hollow tube, the second stage was a simple, logical step. What if this tube, as it grew, began to fray at the end, splitting into a small, downy tuft? Suddenly, you have a stage 2 feather. This is the dino fuzz we see on Sinosauropteryx, and this is a revolutionary invention. A simple, hollow tube offers no insulation, but a downy tuft is a masterpiece of it. That small, branching structure is a perfect, tiny net for trapping a layer of air, and trapped air is the very definition of insulation. This was the solution to the warm-blooded problem. This was the blanket. And for millions of years, this was enough. But evolution, in its patient, accidental way, kept tinkering. What if one of those filaments in the downy tuft, the one in the very center, became stronger and longer than all the others? Suddenly, you have a central stalk, a rachis. And what if the other, smaller filaments, instead of splitting off the tip, began to organize themselves along the sides of this new, central stalk? Now you have a stage 3 feather, a true, symmetrical branching structure, a feather that looks for all the world like one you might find in a modern bird. And finally, one last, subtle and world-changing tweak. What if the branches, the barbs, on one side of that central stalk grew just a little bit shorter and a little bit stiffer than the ones on the other side? You now have an asymmetrical feather. And an asymmetrical feather, when moved through the air, is no longer just a blanket. It is an airfoil. It is a wing. It is the single, physical key to unlocking the sky. This was the journey. A journey that began with a simple protective tile of armor, and through a series of small accidental steps, each one a slight improvement on the last, ended as a masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering. The feather was not designed for flight. It was an accident, and it was an accident that would begin as a simple, humble coat, a solution to the most ancient and persistent of all problems, the cold. The feather, then, was not born from a desire to fly. It was born from a much more urgent and much more ancient need. It was born from the cold. It was the solution to the great warm-blooded problem, the perfect custom-made blanket for a high-performance engine. Let us return for a moment to that small, turkey-sized maniraptor. We pictured it as a tiny, walking cup of coffee, hopelessly losing its precious, hard-won metabolic heat to the surrounding air through its naked reptilian scales. It was a creature trapped in a cycle of desperate, inefficient energy loss. Now, let us picture that same creature, but covered, as Sinosauropteryx was, in a thick, dense coat of this new, Stage 2 dino fuzz. A single filament-like feather does very little, but a million of them, growing together, form a biological marvel. Each downy, branching tuft is a tiny, three-dimensional net. And the true genius of this structure is not in the feather itself, but in the space it creates between the feathers. It is a net designed to catch and to hold a layer of air, trapping it close to the body. This is the very same principle we use today. We fill our winter jackets, our sleeping bags, with the downy feathers of birds, or with synthetic fibers that mimic them. We are not being warmed by the feathers themselves. We are being warmed by our own body heat, reflected back at us by the layer of still, trapped air that the down has created. This new feathered coat was, for the small theropod, a revolutionary, state-of-the-art down jacket. The effect on its life would have been immediate and profound. The constant hemorrhaging loss of heat was suddenly, dramatically reduced. The internal furnace, which had been burning at full power just to stay alive, could now be turned down. The entire metabolic equation of its life was rewritten. It was, in a single evolutionary step, set free. It no longer needed to spend every waking moment hunting just to break even on its energy budget. It now had a surplus. It had endurance. It could survive a cold snap. It could hunt in the cool of the dawn, or in the deep of the night when its cold-blooded prey and its scaly rivals were sluggish and vulnerable. This coat was a superpower. It was a cloak of invisibility for the thermal world. Imagine it now, a small feathered predator moving silently through the fern-covered undergrowth. It is not a lizard. It is not, in the classical sense, a reptile. It is a new kind of creature entirely, a fast, warm, and highly efficient hunter. It is a creature that, in its form and its function, is now far, far closer to a modern, ground-dwelling bird than to the great scaly Allosaurus that is its distant, lumbering cousin. For millions of years, this was the primary and perhaps the only job of the feather. It was a tool for survival, a tool for efficiency. It was a simple, practical, and life-saving coat. But evolution is a relentless tinkerer. Once an invention exists, once a new structure is in place, life will always find new, creative, and sometimes beautiful new ways to use it. This simple, fuzzy, and practical coat was about to become something else entirely. It was about to become a canvas. For a very long time, this was the end of the story. We had a fuzzy, insulated, and warm-blooded hunter. But what color was this new, downy coat? This question seemed to be a permanent mystery, a line that science could never cross. Color, after all, is one of the most fleeting things in nature. It is the first thing to be destroyed by time. We can find a 150 million year old bone, but we cannot find a 150 million year old color. To even guess at the color of a dinosaur seemed like an act of pure fantasy, a choice for children's books and movie monsters, but not a subject for serious academic study. And yet, once again, the rocks of China held a secret, a clue so small, so microscopic, that it had been overlooked for years. The answer, it turned out, was not in the color itself, which had vanished eons ago. The answer was in the machinery that made the color. Inside the feathers of a modern bird, and as it turns out, inside the feathers of a dinosaur, are tiny, microscopic, pigment-filled capsules. They are called melanosomes. These are the tiny biological paintballs that give a feather its color. They are the physical structures that are filled with the pigment melanin. And here is the beautiful, simple, and revolutionary secret. These melanosomes have different shapes depending on the color they create. Melanosomes that produce black or dark gray colors, the eumelanin, are long, skinny, and shaped like a tiny sausage. Melanosomes that produce reddish-brown or rufous colors, the pheomelanin, are small, round, and shaped like a tiny meatball. And a feather that has no melanosomes at all is quite simply white. This was a fascinating piece of modern biology, but it became a time machine when, in the late 2000s, scientists decided to turn a scanning electron microscope, a machine capable of seeing these microscopic shapes, onto the fossils themselves. What they found was a miracle of preservation. The feather, as it fossilized, had decayed, leaving behind a dark carbon film. But the melanosomes, which are incredibly tough and durable, had not decayed. They were still there, millions of them, their tiny 3D shapes perfectly preserved within the fossil's impression, like tiny seeds scattered in the mud. The code was broken. For the first time, we had the color key to the Mesozoic, and the poster child for this revolution was a small, feathered dinosaur called Archaeopteryx. It was a creature with long, feathered legs and arms, a perfect four-winged dinosaur. And its fossils were so exquisitely preserved that scientists were able to map, with incredible precision, the exact locations of these different-shaped melanosomes all over its body. For the first time in 150 million years, they were able to paint by numbers a dinosaur, not with fantasy, but with data. And the result was breathtaking. Archaeopteryx was not a drab, muddy brown. It was a creature of striking, dramatic, and beautiful display. Its body was a sleek, dark grey or black. Its wings, on both its arms and its legs, were patterned with bold white stripes. And as a final, magnificent flourish, it had a bright, reddish-brown, speckled crest on its head, a shock of colour, exactly like the crest of a modern-day woodpecker. This was not the colour of camouflage. This was not a practical coat. This was a billboard. This was a creature that was actively and loudly communicating. That simple, practical, downy coat, which had begun as a humble tool for staying warm, had now, definitively, become a canvas for art. It had become a way to speak, to shout, to signal to the world. And this discovery opened a new, beautiful window into the behavior of these ancient creatures. That stunning black and white, red-crested coat of Archaeopteryx did more than just prove that dinosaurs had color. It proved that they had intent. This was not a pattern born of random chance. This was a statement. This was a costume, a uniform, a deliberate and carefully evolved piece of communication. And what was this newly feathered, newly colorful creature trying to say? It was, in all likelihood, saying the same things that a modern, colorful bird says. It was saying, "I am here." It was saying, "This is my territory." And it was, most importantly of all, whispering to a potential mate, "Look at me. I am the one you should choose." For the first time in our story, we must introduce a new and incredibly powerful engine of evolution, an engine that is just as strong, and sometimes even stronger, than the simple, brutal drive for survival. This is the engine of sexual selection. Natural selection, the survival of the fittest, is a simple game. Can you live long enough to reproduce? Are you fast enough to escape a predator? Are you strong enough to catch your prey? But sexual selection is a different game entirely. It is not about surviving. It is about impressing. It is a game in which the fittest are not necessarily the strongest, but the most attractive. We see this game played out in the modern bird world with spectacular and sometimes absurd results. Think of the peacock. Its tail is a masterpiece of iridescent, hypnotic beauty. It is also a biological nightmare. It is heavy, it is cumbersome, and it is a giant neon sign that shouts to every predator in the jungle, "Here I am, come and eat me." From the perspective of pure, practical survival, it is one of the worst inventions in the history of life. And yet, it exists. It exists for one simple reason: the peahen prefers it. To her, a male who can not only survive with such a ridiculous, dangerous, and energetically expensive burden, but can also grow one that is large and beautiful, must be a male of incredible strength and superior genes. The tail is an honest signal. It is a costly, beautiful advertisement of his genetic quality. Now, let us return to the floor of the Jurassic forest. That bright, red-crested Archaeopteryx is a peacock in miniature. That brilliant splash of color, that bold striping on its wings, serves the same purpose. It is a signal. A male in a dim, fern-covered clearing would have fanned out his striped arm feathers, bobbed his red-crested head, and performed a dance, a ritual, a display. He was communicating his health, his vigor, his quality as a mate. This new job for the feather, as a tool for communication, changed everything. It was no longer just a humble, practical coat for staying warm. It was now a tool for art, for persuasion, for beauty. And this evolutionary pressure, this new game of impressing a mate or intimidating a rival, began to push the feather's evolution in a new and very specific direction. It was no longer enough for the feathers to be just fuzzy. To be a good signal, they had to be seen. They needed a larger surface area. They needed to be big. And this new desire to show off, to create a bigger, more impressive billboard, would have a profound and completely unintended consequence. It would begin to change the shape and size of the feathers in the one place where they would matter most: the arms. This new evolutionary game, the game of sexual selection, began to shape the feather in a new and dramatic direction. To be a truly effective signal, a feather needed more than just color. It needed surface area. It needed to be seen from a distance. A small, downy tuft was a good blanket, but it was a terrible billboard. And so, evolution began to favor a new kind of feather, one that was larger, broader, and more defined. This was the stage 3 feather we spoke of earlier. The downy tufts began to organize themselves, fusing at their base to form a strong central stalk, a rachis. And the filaments, which were once a chaotic fluff, now grew in an organized parallel fashion from the sides of this stalk, like the branches of a pine. This was the birth of the pennaceous feather, the veined feather, the classic feather shape that we all know. And the fossil record once again shows us this step in breathtaking detail. We must turn our attention to another remarkable fossil from the Chinese lake beds, a creature called Caudipteryx. Caudipteryx was a small theropod dinosaur, about the size of a modern and very strange-looking turkey. Its long, powerful legs and its body proportions tell us, without any doubt, that it was a fast runner. It was a creature built for a life entirely on the ground. It could not fly. It could not even glide. And yet, when we look at its fossils, we see something astonishing. On its small, stubby arms, it had a magnificent, symmetrical fan of large, complex, veined feathers. They were organized just like the primary feathers of a modern bird's wing, but they were, in a very crucial way, not wings. The key is in that word, symmetrical. If you look at one of these Archaeopteryx feathers, the central stalk, the rachis, runs perfectly down the middle. The vein, or the blade of the feather, is exactly the same width on both sides. This makes it a beautiful leaf-like shape. It is a perfect structure for display. It is large, it is flat, and it would have caught the light beautifully. But this perfect symmetry makes it utterly, completely, and totally useless for flight. A flight feather, the kind that can lift a bird into the air, is a masterpiece of asymmetry. The central stalk is offset, making the leading edge of the feather, the part that cuts into the wind, narrow, stiff, and strong, while the trailing edge is wide and flexible. This is the basic, non-negotiable shape of an airfoil, the shape that creates lift. Archaeopteryx had none of that. Its feathers were, in every way, built for art, not for aerodynamics. Imagine it now. This fast, ground-running, turkey-sized dinosaur waving its feathered arms in a complex, ritualistic dance. It would have fanned them out to intimidate a rival or to impress a mate. And at the end of its long, bony tail, it had another, even more spectacular fan of long, symmetrical feathers, which it could have waved and flashed like a great ceremonial banner. The feather had now completed another crucial stage of its journey. It was no longer a simple, fuzzy coat for warmth. It was now a complex, beautiful, and highly engineered tool for communication. It had every single component of a modern flight feather: the central stalk, the barbs, the branching barbules. It was, in effect, a perfect, high-performance wing. It was just missing the one, final, subtle, and world-changing ingredient. It was still a billboard, not a plane, but the very existence of these new, large structures on the arms would entirely by accident open the door to the next great evolutionary leap. The body of the theropod was now, almost by chance, becoming flight-ready. We have now in our journey a new kind of creature, a fast, warm-blooded, ground-dwelling hunter covered in a downy coat for warmth, and now waving a set of large, complex and colourful feathers on its arms for display. This creature is, in almost every way, beginning to look like a bird. But a feathered arm is not a wing, and a feathered body is not a flyer. To achieve flight, to conquer the sky, is to enter a war against the most relentless, unforgiving force in the universe: gravity. To fly, an organism must be two things that are almost always in direct opposition to one another. It must be incredibly strong, and it must be incredibly light. The problem for a vertebrate is bone. Bone is a biological marvel. It is a living, growing framework that gives our bodies structure and strength. But it is also a compromise. It is a heavy, dense, and costly material. It is a biological stone, and for any creature that dreams of the sky, its own solid skeleton is its anchor, tying it to the ground. Look at a modern bird. If you have ever held a small bird in your hand, you know the feeling. They are almost impossibly light. They feel like a fragile, hollow, and weightless puff of air. This is because their skeleton is an absolute masterpiece of natural engineering. A bird's bone is not solid. It is not even just hollow like a simple straw. It is a thin-walled pneumatic tube, reinforced from the inside with a delicate, crisscrossing network of struts and trusses, like the framework of a bridge. It is a structure that achieves the absolute maximum of strength for the absolute minimum of weight. And for over a century, The logic seemed simple and unassailable. Birds have hollow bones because they fly. It was the adaptation that made flight possible. And so, scientists assumed that when they finally found the fossil of the first primitive flying dinosaur, they would find this one crucial adaptation, the first hollow bones. But the fossil record, as it so often does, held a surprise that would turn this entire logical assumption on its head. The discovery came not from a new bird-like fossil. It came from the old ones. It came from the giants. Paleontologists began to look more closely at the skeletons of the massive, multi-ton and utterly flightless theropods. They looked at the vertebrae of an Allosaurus. They examined the colossal neck bones of a Tyrannosaurus rex. And they found that they were already hollow. The bones of these giant, ground-bound predators were riddled with complex, intricate, air-filled cavities. They were, in a word, pneumatic. They had the same lightweight, air-filled skeletal structure as a modern bird. This was a stunning revelation. A T-Rex, a creature that weighed 8 tons, was not evolving to be lighter. It was not trying to fly. The problem of weight, for a giant, was the opposite. It needed a stronger, more robust frame. And yet, here were the bones of a bird, hiding in the skeleton of a monster. This discovery meant one revolutionary thing. Hollow bones did not evolve for flight. They evolved tens of millions of years before flight. They were an ancient theropod family trait, a feature that was present in the giants and inherited by their small maniraptoran cousins. And if this complex, lightweight skeleton was not an adaptation for flying, then what on earth was it for? The answer, it turns out, is not about gravity, it is about air. The bones were not hollow because they were trying to be light. They were hollow because they were being invaded by a new, powerful and hyper-efficient respiratory system. They were the scaffolding for an engine. To understand why the bones of a T-Rex were hollow, we must look at the most efficient breathing engine on the planet today. We must look at the lungs of a modern bird. When you or I, as mammals, take a breath, the process is a simple, two-way street. We inhale. Air is pulled into our lungs, which are a pair of spongy, balloon-like sacs. The oxygen is transferred to our blood. Then we exhale, pushing that same stale, carbon dioxide-rich air back out through the same tubes it came in. This system is simple, and it is fundamentally inefficient. It is a tidal in and out flow. This means that at every moment the fresh air we inhale is instantly mixing with the old, stale air that is left over from the last breath. We are never ever getting a full breath of pure, 100% fresh oxygen. A bird does not have this problem. Evolution, in its genius, provided it with a system that is a masterpiece of efficiency, a system that would be the envy of any human engineer. A bird does not have simple, balloon-like lungs. It has a one-way street. When a bird breathes, the air does not just go into its lungs and then back out. It is pulled through a complex, looping, one-way circuit, a system of rigid, non-inflating lungs that are connected to a whole series of separate, balloon-like air sacs. These sacs are tucked all throughout its body, in its chest, in its abdomen, and, most critically, extending deep into the hollows of its bones. The cycle is a two-breath marvel. On the first inhale, the air is pulled past the lungs and into a set of air sacs at the back. On the first exhale, that fresh air is pushed out of the sacs and through the lungs, where oxygen is exchanged. On the second inhale, the now stale air is pulled out of the lungs and into a different set of air sacs at the front. On the second exhale, that stale air is finally pushed out of the body. The result of this complex one-way flow is a constant, non-stop, unidirectional stream of pure, fresh, oxygenated air passing over the lung surfaces. There is no mixing, no stale air. It is the most efficient oxygen extraction system in the vertebrate world. It is the reason a goose can fly at 30,000 feet over the top of Mount Everest in air that would leave a human unconscious in minutes. And this is the secret of the hollow bones. The bones of the theropods were not hollow in the sense of being empty. They were pneumatic. They were filled with air. The fossilized bones of Allosaurus and T-Rex are riddled with the telltale openings and internal chambers that are the unmistakable signature of this same air sac system. The bones were hollow because they were part of the respiratory tract. The theropods, tens of millions of years before flight, had already evolved this hyper-efficient, bird-like breathing engine. This discovery is profound. It tells us that the small, ground-dwelling Maniraptor, our feathered hunter, was not just a warm-blooded creature. It was a creature with a high-performance, supercharged avian lung. It was an animal that could extract more energy from every single breath than any mammal of its time. This engine was not built for flight. It was built for endurance. It was the engine of a relentless, high-stamina pursuit predator. It was the biological furnace that powered its warm-blooded, high-speed and frenetic lifestyle. And so, by the late Jurassic, our creature is now in possession of two of the most crucial and most accidental prerequisites for flight. It has a full, dense coat of complex feathers, evolved for warmth and display. And it has a lightweight, hollow, pneumatic skeleton, the byproduct of a powerful avian breathing system. It has the feathers and the lightweight frame, all before a single thought of flight had ever occurred. The evolutionary toolbox was now filling with the most extraordinary and coincidental of tools. And the next one to be discovered was a small, delicate, and strangely familiar little bone. For many of us, it is a small V-shaped token, the centerpiece of a holiday tradition, the wishbone, a delicate, brittle arch of bone from a chicken or a turkey, a minor curiosity that we dry on a windowsill and then break for a moment of simple luck. But in the living bird, this humble-looking bone is one of the most critical, high-performance pieces of engineering in its entire body. Its scientific name is the furcula, and it is not a passive, static bone. It is a spring. Formed by the fusion of the two collarbones, or clavicles, the wishbone sits at the very front of the bird's chest, forming a strong, flexible, V-shaped strut that connects the two shoulders. When a bird is in flight, on the powerful downward stroke of its wings, its chest muscles contract with immense force. This force, as it pulls the wings down, also squeezes and bends the furcula, loading it with elastic, potential energy, like pulling back the string of a bow. Then, on the upstroke, the bone springs back to its original shape, releasing that stored energy and helping to power the wings back up, ready for the next stroke. It is an ingenious, energy-saving device that is absolutely essential to the mechanics of modern, powered flight. And so, for over a century, the logic was unassailable. The wishbone, like hollow bones, was a unique invention of birds. It was an adaptation for flight. Scientists assumed that when we finally found the ancestor of all birds, this unique V-shaped bone would be its defining new feature. But then, as paleontologists began to look closer at the skeletons they had known for decades, the story once again was turned completely on its head. They found one in Allosaurus, a large, powerful, and utterly ground-bound predator of the Jurassic. They found them in the raptors, like Velociraptor and Deinonychus. And then, in a discovery that seemed almost comical, they found a massive, robust, fully formed wishbone in the chest of a Tyrannosaurus rex. The bird bone was not a bird bone at all. It was an ancient theropod family trait. This was a stunning revelation. A T-Rex was not springing its shoulders to fly. It was, quite clearly, doing something else. And so, scientists had to ask for a second time, if this bone did not evolve for flight, what was its original dinosaurian purpose? The answer, it turns in, is one of brute force practicality. In us, our collarbones are two separate struts. In the theropods, they fused together. And for a bipedal predator that was constantly grappling with struggling prey, a creature that was using its powerful arms to seize, to slash, and to tear, this fused V-shaped strut was a brilliant piece of structural reinforcement. It was a brace. It connected the two shoulders and stabilized the entire chest cavity against the violent, tearing motions of the arms. It was an adaptation for strength on the ground. And yet, there it was, this ancient reptilian shoulder brace, which had evolved to help a predator hold onto its lunch, just so happened to be a perfect V-shaped, spring-loaded strut, ideally positioned tens of millions of years later to be co-opted for an entirely new and far more delicate purpose. The toolkit of our accidental flyer is now almost comically full. Our ground-dwelling theropod now has a warm feathered coat. It has lightweight, hollow bones. It has a hyper-efficient avian lung. And now it has a pre-made, spring-loaded wishbone. The body was, in almost every way, ready for flight. But it was still a creature of the ground. And the next set of adaptations would be a series of small, subtle, but crucial changes in how it thought and how it slept. How can we possibly know a behavior? How can we know something so delicate, so private, and so fleeting as the way a creature slept 125 million years ago? We have their bones, their teeth, their footprints. But a sleeping posture is an act, not an object. It is a moment, and then it is gone. It seems an impossible question to answer. Unless, by some 1 in a billion miracle, that very moment, that act of sleeping, is preserved forever in stone. Once again, we must return to the quiet volcanic lakebeds of Liaoning, China, the fossil bed that is a perfect, silken, photographic snapshot of its ancient world. In the early 2000s, paleontologists there uncovered a fossil that is, perhaps, one of the most beautiful and most deeply human ever found. The fossil was a tiny theropod dinosaur. It was not a jumble of scattered bones, its skeleton ripped apart by predators or scattered by a river. It was complete, it was articulated, and it was preserved in 3 dimensions. And it was asleep. The creature, which they named Mei Long, a beautiful fitting name which means sleeping dragon, was found in a position of perfect, tranquil repose. It was curled up in a tight, compact ball. Its long, slender tail was wrapped neatly around its body, almost like a cat, and its small, delicate, bird-like head was not held high or snapped back in the throes of death. Its head was tucked perfectly under one of its forelimbs. It was a creature that had been sleeping and was buried in an instant by a silent, gentle fall of volcanic ash. It had died in its sleep, and it had never woken up. Now, why is this posture so utterly, profoundly revolutionary? Because this is exactly how a modern bird sleeps. Go into a chicken coop at night, or look at a robin or a duck settled on its nest. You will see this exact same curled-up posture. They tuck their beaks and their unfeathered faces under their wing feathers. And this is not just a pose for comfort. It is a crucial, non-negotiable, heat-saving adaptation. A bird is a warm-blooded furnace, and its beak, its nostrils, and its eyes are thermal windows, places of exposed, unfeathered skin where its precious, hard-won body heat can pour out into the cold night air. By tucking its head under its wing, the bird is sealing that window. It is using its own beautifully insulated, downy arm feathers as a personal built-in blanket. It is wrapping itself in its own personal sleeping bag to conserve every last precious degree of warmth. The Mei Long fossil, that sleeping dragon preserved in its final peaceful moment, is definitive, undeniable proof that this small theropod dinosaur was doing the exact same thing. This single, beautiful fossil tells us 2 revolutionary truths. First, it is perhaps the most powerful proof we have that these creatures were, without a shadow of a doubt, warm-blooded. A cold-blooded animal has no need to conserve heat. It simply becomes the temperature of the air around it. This creature was fighting the cold. It was protecting its internal engine. And second, and perhaps most beautifully for our story, it tells us finally what those large, complex, veined feathers on the arms were for. Before they were ever used for display, before they were ever used for flight, they were a piece of essential, life-saving survival gear. They were a blanket. They were a thermal shield. The very structure that one day we would call a wing was, for millions of years, simply a creature's own, built-in and perfectly designed sleeping bag. The arm was now officially a blanket. The toolkit was almost complete. All that was needed now was one final, subtle, and world-changing tweak. A simple, anatomical twist of the wrist that would turn that blanket into a wing. The puzzle is now almost complete. Our creature has the lightweight, air-filled bones of a high-performance athlete. It has the hyper-efficient one-way lungs of a modern bird. It has the spring-loaded wishbone of a flyer. And it has a set of large, complex and beautiful feathers on its arms, which it uses as a warm, thermal blanket. Its arm is, for all intents and purposes, a proto-wing. But it is still missing one final and absolutely crucial piece of machinery. It is a piece of anatomy so subtle that you would never, ever notice it unless you were an engineer. It is a piece that is all about motion. Think about the arm of a ground-dwelling theropod like a velociraptor. That arm, with its 3 sharp slashing claws, is a weapon. It is a tool for grasping. It needs to be flexible. It needs to be able to move in and out, up and down. It needs to be able to seize a struggling lizard, to hold it, to tear at it. Now, think about the wing of a bird. A bird's wing is not a grasping tool. A bird does not catch its prey with its wings. A wing has one singular and highly specialized job: to flap. And this flapping motion, this flight stroke, is not a simple up and down hinge. It is a complex, swiveling, figure-8 motion. On the powerful downstroke, the wing must twist and snap, its feathers swiveling to catch the air and provide thrust. And on the upstroke, it must twist again, its feathers slicing cleanly through the air with minimal resistance. Even more importantly, when a bird is not flying, it cannot have these long, delicate wings sticking out, getting in the way, getting broken. It needs a way to fold them neatly and safely back against its body. A velociraptor could not do this. Its grasping, clawed hands could not fold away in that neat Z shape. To do this, to achieve both the powerful flight stroke and the neat sideways fold, a bird needs a very special, very particular kind of wrist. It needs a wrist that is not a flexible, all-purpose joint, but a highly specialized, swiveling hinge. And this motion is made possible by one single, beautiful and elegant little bone. It is called the semilunate carpal. It is a C-shaped or half-moon-shaped bone in the wrist, and it is a masterpiece of biological engineering. It effectively locks the wrist, preventing it from bending up and down like our own, but allowing it one single, powerful and swiveling direction of movement. It is the anatomical key to the flight stroke, and so the search was on. Paleontologists set out to find the fossil that showed the first appearance of this magical little half-moon-shaped bone, assuming it would be the final smoking gun of the first true bird. And you can, by now, guess exactly what they found. They did not find it in the first bird. They found it deep in the theropod lineage. They found it, clear as day, in the fossils of Velociraptor and Deinonychus. This was, perhaps, the most stunning revelation of all. This perfect, wing-folding wrist joint, this anatomical key to the flight stroke, had evolved for a creature that lived entirely on the ground. And if this hyper-specialized wrist wasn't for flying, What on earth was it for? Imagine the velociraptor again. Its arms are not for flapping, they are for snatching, and as it lunges for a small, fast-moving mammal, it needs to be able to whip its clawed hands forward and inward with incredible speed and force. This half-moon bone was the engine of that motion. It was a predatory stroke. It was a biological switchblade, a joint that allowed the dinosaur to snap its claws inward, pinning its struggling victim against its chest with a deadly, rapid, flicking motion. It was an adaptation for hunting, a joint for killing, and it just so happens, in one of evolution's most beautiful, profound, and magnificent coincidences, that this exact same motion, this inward, swiveling, predatory stroke, is the exact same motion that, millions of years later, when covered in a broad fan of asymmetrical feathers, would become the powerful, thrust-generating flight stroke of a modern bird. And so, here we are. We have arrived at a pivotal and truly remarkable moment in our story. Let us pause for a moment in the deep, fern-covered forests of the late Jurassic and take stock of the creature that evolution has, entirely by accident, assembled. Before us stands a small, warm-blooded and agile theropod, a Maniraptoran, a hunter. And this creature, this dinosaur, now possesses, purely by coincidence, every single key component that is necessary for powered flight. Let us review the toolkit, the list of accidental miracles. It has, on its arms, a full and magnificent set of large, complex, veined feathers. They did not evolve for flight. They evolved first as an insulated blanket to keep it warm while it slept, and second, as a beautiful, colourful billboard to advertise itself to a mate. But they are, for all intents and purposes, a perfect pre-made airfoil. It has a skeleton of lightweight, hollow, air-filled bones. This did not evolve for lightness. It evolved as the necessary scaffolding for a hyper-efficient, one-way, bird-like respiratory system. But it is nonetheless a perfect, lightweight, flight-ready frame. It has that powerful avian lung system. It did not evolve to breathe in the thin, high-altitude air. It evolved to give a ground-dwelling predator the high-stamina engine it needed to chase down its prey. But it is nonetheless the perfect engine for flight. It has a strong, flexible, V-shaped wishbone, the furcula. It did not evolve as an elastic spring to power the wings. It evolved as a sturdy, structural brace to reinforce the chest of a predator that was grappling with its victims. But it is, nonetheless, a perfect, pre-made flight spring. And finally, it has that beautiful half-moon-shaped wrist bone, the semilunate carpal. It did not evolve for a flapping flight stroke. It evolved to allow a hunter to make a lightning-fast, inward, predatory stroke to snatch its prey. But it is nonetheless the exact same joint that is required for the powerful, swiveling, propulsive motion of a wing. This is, perhaps, the most profound and beautiful example in the entire history of life of a concept known as exaptation. An exaptation is an evolutionary trait that evolves for one specific purpose, but, entirely by chance, turns out to be perfectly suited for a completely new and often far grander purpose. Millions of years later, the feather is an exaptation, the hollow bone is an exaptation, the wishbone is an exaptation. Flight, then, was not a single grand invention. It was not a sudden, desperate leap from a branch. It was an accident. It was the slow, patient, and completely unintentional assembly of a complex machine, where every single part was designed and built for a different job. So let us look at our creature one last time. It is a dinosaur. It is a predator. It lives and hunts entirely on the ground. But it is also a perfect flight-ready machine. It is a biological airplane, fully assembled, sitting on the runway, that just doesn't know how to fly yet. The body was ready, the tools were in place, the engine was built, All that was left was for evolution to provide the final gentle spark, the one last behavioral push that would take this earthbound hunter and lift it at last into the open and unclaimed sky. The creature is ready. The toolkit is full. We have, standing before us in the shadows of the Jurassic, a perfect, flight-ready dinosaur. But a toolkit is not a behavior. A set of perfectly engineered parts does not, in itself, create an action. A new and powerful evolutionary pressure was needed. A reason to take these tools, the grasping feathered arm, the powerful hollow-boned legs, and do something entirely new with them, something as counterintuitive, as energetically expensive, and as mechanically difficult as flight. This is perhaps the most contentious, most debated, and most beautifully mysterious part of our entire journey. How and why did flight begin? For over a century, the scientific world has been engaged in a quiet and deeply fascinating debate, a discussion that has split the field into two great opposing camps. It is a mystery with two possible and compelling solutions. The first of these is the arboreal theory, a name that simply means living in trees. We call this, more poetically, the trees down hypothesis. This idea, which was the first and for a long time the most popular, imagines that the ancestor of birds was not a ground dweller at all. It was a small, agile creature that had learned to climb, a creature that lived its life in the canopy of the great Jurassic forests. And for this creature, flight began not as a leap, but as a fall. The second and more recent theory is the cursorial theory, which means related to running. We call this the ground-up hypothesis. This idea argues the exact opposite. It looks at the theropod ancestors, the velociraptors, and their kin, and sees them as they were, fast, agile, ground-dwelling predators. And for this creature, flight began not as a fall, but as a leap to catch its prey, a leap to escape a larger hunter, a leap that, with every generation, became just a little bit more of a flight. Both of these theories are elegant, both are powerful, both are supported by intriguing pieces of evidence, and both have significant, challenging problems. This is not a simple, solved question. It is the very heart of the mystery. To find the answer, we must explore them both. We must weigh the evidence, and we must walk for a time in the footsteps of two very different, hypothetical creatures. Let us begin our exploration with the oldest and perhaps the most intuitive of the two ideas. Let us leave the forest floor and climb high into the conifer-filled canopy to imagine a life lived among the branches. Let us begin then with the first, and for a long time the most cherished of these ideas. Let us accept the logic of the trees down hypothesis and imagine the creature it describes. The story begins not on the open plains, but in the deep, fern-choked forests of the Jurassic. And for a small, warm-blooded, turkey-sized theropod, the forest floor was a world of constant and thundering danger. It was a world ruled by giants like Allosaurus, predators that were larger, faster, and more powerful, creatures that would have seen our small, feathered hero as a simple, easy meal. In this world, the ground was a death trap, but the high canopy of the great conifer trees, the world of the branches, that was a world of safety. It was a three-dimensional, complex, and unnavigable world for a multi-ton giant. It was a refuge. But how, you might ask, would a dinosaur, a creature we have always imagined as a ground runner, get up there? We must look again at the toolkit it already had. Look at its very name, Maniraptora. The hand snatchers. These creatures had long, flexible, three-fingered arms, and each of those fingers was tipped with a sharp, curved, and formidable claw. We have always assumed these were weapons, tools for slashing and holding prey. But what if they were also grappling hooks? And look at their feet. The raptors, in particular, had that specialized, sickle-shaped killing claw on their inner toe. But what if that claw was not just for killing? What if it was also a perfect biological climbing iron, a crampon designed to dig into the rough, grooved bark of a conifer trunk? In this view, our ancestor was not just a runner, it was a climber. Imagine it then, a creature that is part dinosaur, part squirrel. It scurries up the great, rough trunks of the ancient trees, using all four of its clawed limbs, finding safety in the high branches. Here, in the canopy, it finds a new world. It is safe from the giants, and it finds a new source of food, the insects, the lizards, the small, primitive mammals that were already living in this arboreal world. It is a perfect new life. But this new, three-dimensional world presents a new and constant problem. A problem of gravity, a problem of falling. Imagine this small feathered climber as it leaps from one branch to another and misses. Or imagine it is startled by a predator, a snake or a larger tree dweller, and it slips. It begins to fall. And in that moment, as it plummets towards the hard, unforgiving ground far below, something remarkable happens. It instinctively splays out all four of its limbs, just as a modern flying squirrel does, in a desperate, panicked attempt to slow its descent. And those large, broad, veined feathers on its arms, the feathers that had evolved as a warm blanket, the feathers that had evolved as a colorful sexual display, are suddenly, and entirely by accident, co-opted for a new and life-saving purpose. They are no longer a blanket, they are a parachute. The air catches in the broad, flat surfaces of the feathers. The deadly, terminal plummet is slowed, just a little, into a more controlled, manageable fall. The creature, instead of being dashed to pieces on the forest floor, lands hard, but survives. And in that single terrifying moment, a new and powerful evolutionary pressure is born. In this population of tree-dwelling dinosaurs, any individual with slightly larger arm feathers, with slightly broader or stiffer or more organized feathers, would have parachuted just a little bit better. They would have drifted just a little bit further. They would have survived the fall that their less feathered or less broad-feathered brothers did not. Generation by generation, this single, selective pressure would have refined this new ability. The parachute would have become a glider. The random, panicked splaying of the limbs would have become a more controlled, deliberate act. The creature had learned to use its accidental wings to turn a fall into a drift. The trees down theory is beautiful. It is intuitive. It is a simple, logical, step-by-step progression from climbing to falling to parachuting to gliding. And from gliding, the path to a true powered flapping flight seems like a very small and very inevitable next step. The trees down theory is a beautiful, elegant, and compelling story. It paints a picture of a logical, step-by-step progression from the safety of the trees. And for over a century, it was the reigning and almost undisputed explanation for the origin of flight. But in the late 20th century, as our understanding of the theropods became clearer, a new and in some ways more radical theory began to emerge. A theory that did not require a hypothetical, tree-climbing ancestor that we had never found. A theory that was born, instead, from the fossils we did have. This is the ground-up hypothesis. And it argues that flight was not born from a fall, but from a leap. This story begins not in the high, safe canopy, but where we have always known these creatures to be, on the forest floor. It looks at the maniraptors, the hand snatchers like Deinonychus and Velociraptor, and it takes them at their word. It accepts them as they were, fast, agile, bipedal, ground-dwelling, pursuit predators. Now, let us imagine the life of one of these small, feathered hunters. It is not a clumsy, lumbering creature. It is a warm-blooded, high-performance athlete. Its avian lungs and hollow-boned frame built for a life of explosive, energetic action. It is hunting. Its prey is a small, primitive mammal or a fast, darting lizard. The prey does not run in a straight line. It dodges, it weaves, it zigs, and it zags. To catch this prey, our theropod must be a master of agility. It must leap, it must twist, it must pounce. And in that moment of the pounce, that explosive, athletic leap, it would have, instinctively, thrown out its arms for balance. Just as a human, leaping over a stream, will throw out their arms to steady themselves in mid-air. And what was on those arms? A large, broad, and magnificent fan of vanned feathers, the feathers that had evolved as a blanket and as a billboard. As the creature leaps, the air catches in these accidental proto-wings, and this creates a tiny, almost imperceptible puff of lift. It doesn't fly, it doesn't even glide, but in that split second, its leap is assisted. It can jump just a little bit higher, just a little bit further. It can hang in the air for just a fraction of a second longer, and in the brutal, lightning-fast calculus of the hunt, a fraction of a second is the difference between catching a meal and starving. In this scenario, a new evolutionary pressure is born. Any individual in this population with slightly larger or broader or better angled arm feathers would have a more effective mid-air stabilizer. They would be the more successful hunters. They would be the ones to eat, to survive, and to pass on their genes for slightly more developed proto-wings. But this theory has another beautiful and more recent variation. It's not just about leaping at prey. It's about escaping predators or simply gaining a better vantage point. Modern scientists, observing living feathered birds, like a young chukar partridge, which can run but cannot yet fly, noticed something remarkable. When these birds need to escape up a steep, near-vertical incline like a rocky cliff face or the trunk of a tree, they do something extraordinary. They run vertically up the surface, and as they run, they flap their small, undeveloped wings. But they are not flying. The flapping is not generating lift in the classical sense, it is generating traction. The vigorous downward flap of the wings is angled backwards, pushing the bird's body down and into the cliff face like the spoilers on a race car. This downward force gives its feet the extra supernatural grip they need to continue its vertical run, to defy gravity, to escape to safety. This is called wing-assisted incline running, or WAIR, and suddenly we have a powerful, new, ground-up hypothesis. Perhaps flight began as a simple, desperate escape scramble up the side of a rock or the trunk of a giant tree to escape a larger predator. The evolutionary pressure would be immense. The individuals who could flap their feathered arms more powerfully, who could generate more of this spoiler-like traction, would be the ones who escaped, the ones who lived. Generation by generation, that traction stroke would have become more powerful. The feathers would have become stronger, the muscles would have become larger, until one day the creature, in its desperate, flapping, vertical run, found that its feet were no longer touching the ground at all. The leap had become a flap, the ground up. In this great, fascinating and deeply intellectual debate, this puzzle of trees down versus ground up, science was not just arguing in a vacuum. It was not a simple war of abstract ideas. It had a physical, tangible, and profoundly beautiful piece of evidence, a single fossil that seemed to be the living, breathing, and feathered embodiment of the transition itself. To find it, we must travel back in time, not to the Jurassic, but to our own, much more recent past, to the year 1861. In the limestone quarries of Solnhofen, in Bavaria, Germany. This was not a normal rock quarry. The limestone here was special. It was incredibly fine-grained, smooth and perfect, so perfect that it was quarried for the high-end lithographic printing process. And this fine silken stone was the tomb of an ancient tropical lagoon. In the late Jurassic, this place was a still, quiet and perhaps toxic body of water, its bottom so low in oxygen that no bacteria, no decomposers could survive. Anything that fell into this still chemical soup, a delicate dragonfly, a small fish, or a creature from the land, was not eaten or scattered by scavengers. It was buried gently by a rain of fine, limy mud. It was a perfect photographic snapshot of its world. And in 1861, just 2 years after Charles Darwin had published his revolutionary On the Origin of Species, a book that predicted the existence of missing links, a quarry worker split open a slab of this stone, and there, pressed into the rock, was a perfect, dark and stunning impression. A creature that seemed to defy all classification. It was the missing link, delivered to science at the precise historical moment it was needed most. They named it Archaeopteryx, the ancient wing. It is perhaps the single most beautiful and most important fossil ever found. It is not a jumble of bones. It is an image, a carbon film photograph from 150 million years ago. And it is a perfect, beautiful and messy chimera, a creature of two worlds, captured in a single stone frame. Let us look at it, as those 19th century scientists did, with a mixture of confusion and awe. What is it? First, and most undeniably, it is a dinosaur. Look at its snout. It is not a gentle keratin beak. It is a jaw, and it is filled with a full set of small, sharp reptilian teeth. Look at its wing. It is not just a wing, it is an arm. And from the front of it, 3 distinct, separate theropod fingers emerge, each one tipped with a sharp, curved, grasping claw. And look at its tail. It is not the short, fused, stubby tail of a modern bird. It is a long, bony reptilian tail made of a chain of individual vertebrae, just like the velociraptor that is its cousin. By all these measures, it is a small theropod dinosaur, and yet, surrounding this entire reptilian skeleton is a perfect, unmistakable halo of feathers. And these are not the simple, downy dino fuzz of Sinosauropteryx, the coat for warmth. They are not the symmetrical, showy display feathers of Caudipteryx. The feathers on the wings of Archaeopteryx are long, complex, veined, and in a discovery that changed the world, they are asymmetrical. This is the smoking gun. This is the entire case. As we discussed, an asymmetrical feather with a narrow, stiff leading edge and a wide, flexible trailing edge is a physical, non-negotiable prerequisite for flight. It is an airfoil. It is a structure that is designed by the very laws of physics to generate lift when moved through the air. This was not a blanket, this was not a billboard, this was, undeniably, a wing. Archaeopteryx was the answer. It was the yes to the entire debate. It was a clawed, toothed, long-tailed reptile, and it was, at the same time, a winged, feathered flyer. It was the perfect, tangible proof that the line between dinosaur and bird was not a line at all, but a beautiful, slow, and evolutionary fade. It was the transition, captured in stone. But for all that this magnificent fossil answered, it raised an even more subtle and more pressing new question. It had the wings, but could it fly? This question, this single, simple question, has haunted paleontology for over 150 years. The fossil of Archaeopteryx was a perfect, stone-cold contradiction. It had the hardware, it had the unmistakable asymmetrical airfoils that, by the very laws of physics, should have been able to generate lift. And yet, for all its revolutionary, bird-like features, it was still in its bones a dinosaur. So could it fly? The answer is not a simple yes or no. The answer is a beautiful, messy, and perfect yes, but not very well. It was not a modern bird. It was not a pigeon capable of launching itself vertically from a city street. It was not a hawk capable of soaring for hours on the thermal currents. Archaeopteryx was most likely a clumsy, awkward, and inefficient flyer. It was a prototype. It was the Model T of the skies. It was flight in its very first stumbling draft. And we know this because while it had the wings, it was missing the engine. If you look at the skeleton of a modern flying bird, its power comes from two crucial anatomical features. The first is a massive, deep keel on its breastbone, or sternum. This is a giant, bony anchor, a ridge of bone that juts out from its chest, and its sole purpose is to be the attachment point for the colossal, powerful flight muscles. Archaeopteryx had no such thing. Its breastbone was a flat, small, and likely cartilaginous plate. It had no anchor for the massive engine that powered, sustained, flapping flight would require. The second, and more beautiful, invention of a modern bird is in its shoulder. It has a magical, pulley-like system called the trioceal canal, a small hole formed by the three shoulder bones. A tendon passes through this hole, allowing a muscle that is located under the wing to pull the wing up. This is the key to the powerful, rapid, and efficient upstroke. Archaeopteryx had none of this. It had a simple, reptilian theropod shoulder joint. It could have, without a doubt, used its strong, wishbone-braced chest muscles to power a downstroke, but its upstroke would have been clumsy, weak, and awkward, likely powered by smaller, less efficient muscles on its back. It was, in essence, a machine with a powerful flap down and a very weak flap up. So what, then, could it do? It was not a creature of the open sky, but it was not a prisoner of the ground. Modern science, in the last few decades, has given us a final, powerful clue. Using high-resolution CT scanners, scientists have been able to peer inside the small, delicate, fossilized skull of Archaeopteryx. They have been able to reconstruct the very shape of its brain, and what they found was astonishing. The parts of the brain associated with vision, the optic lobes, were enormous, and the part of the brain responsible for balance, for motor control, for processing a complex, 3D, fast-moving world, the cerebellum, was also significantly enlarged. It had the brain of a flyer. So let us put all the pieces together. It had the aerodynamic wings of a flyer. It had the advanced processing brain of a flyer. But it had the primitive, underpowered reptilian engine of a non-flyer. It was not a creature that could launch from the ground and soar for miles, but it was, almost certainly, a creature that could use its wings. It could have, as the ground-up theory suggests, used its flapping, predatory stroke to scramble up the sides of steep tree trunks, and it could have, as the trees-down theory suggests, climbed those trees with its sharp reptilian claws, and then, from a high branch, launched itself into a long, flapping, gliding descent to another tree or to the forest floor below. It was not a strong flyer, but it was a flyer. It was a beautiful, imperfect, transitional creature, a creature that was living, breathing, and flapping in the perfect, messy grey area between a dinosaur and a bird. It was the first glorious and clumsy attempt, but as the fossil record of China would soon reveal, it was not the only attempt. For a very long time, Archaeopteryx was our only snapshot. It was the single, lonely, transitional fossil, and because it was all we had, we viewed it as the ancestor, the one great-grandfather of every bird that has ever lived. We pictured the story of flight as a single, straight evolutionary line, with Archaeopteryx as the perfect halfway point. And then, once again, the fossil beds of Liaoning, China, exploded this simple, tidy line into a beautiful, chaotic, and magnificent burst of creativity. The fossils that emerged from those ancient lake beds revealed that Archaeopteryx was not the single, lonely prototype. It was just one of an entire, blossoming, evolutionary, avian renaissance. The late Jurassic and early Cretaceous was a time of wild experimentation, an era when evolution, having just discovered the magic of the feather, was trying everything. It was not a single straight line. It was a great, bushy and sprawling tree of different forms, a laboratory of weird and wonderful new ideas. And the most bizarre and perhaps the most beautiful of all these experiments was a creature called Microraptor. Microraptor was a dromaeosaur. It was a true raptor, a small close cousin of the velociraptor itself. But it was tiny, perhaps the size of a modern crow, and the fossils we have of it are so exquisitely, impossibly preserved that we see more than just its bones. We see its entire feathered body. We even, as with Archaeopteryx, know its color. It was a creature covered in sleek, black, iridescent feathers, a shimmering, crow-like blue-green, like the feathers of a modern starling. But that was not the surprise. The surprise was in its wings. And I use the plural deliberately. Microraptor had wings on its arms, long, beautifully formed and unmistakably asymmetrical flight feathers. It was, clearly, a flyer. But the fossils showed, with breathtaking clarity, a second set of identical feathers, long, pugnacious, asymmetrical, flight-ready feathers, on its legs. It was a four-winged dinosaur, a biplane. This creature was a beautiful, strange, and stunning reality. It had, in effect, four wings, one on each of its limbs. This was not a creature that was running on the ground. You cannot be a fast bipedal runner with a set of giant foot-long feathers attached to your ankles. You would trip, you would stumble, you would be a clumsy, inefficient mess. This was the creature of the trees down hypothesis. Microraptor was a climber, a creature that lived its life in the canopy. And when it launched itself from a high branch, it did not just glide on its arms. It splayed all four of its limbs, creating a complex four-winged aerodynamic surface that gave it incredible gliding control. Scientists have long debated how it held these four wings. Did it splay its legs out to the side, like a strange, flat, X-shaped biplane? Or, as some models suggest, did it hold its leg wings under its arm wings, in a tandem, dragonfly-like configuration, creating a single, incredibly stable, high-lift gliding machine? We may never know for sure, but what we do know is that this was not a failed experiment. This was a successful one. Microraptor was a beautiful, efficient, and successful animal that thrived in the forests of the early Cretaceous. But it was not our ancestor. It was a different path. It was a side branch, a beautiful evolutionary tangent that, ultimately, would lead to a dead end. It proved that in the great race to conquer the sky, nature was not taking a single clear path. It was throwing everything at the wall just to see what would stick. Archaeopteryx was one attempt, Microraptor was another. And somewhere else, in that same chaotic and creative forest, a third, and ultimately far more successful, lineage was just beginning to find its way. The lineage that would lead to the true birds. The world of Archaeopteryx and Microraptor was a world of pioneers, of clumsy first drafts and beautiful, strange experiments. They were creatures caught perfectly in the grey area, half dinosaur, half bird, each one a fascinating glimpse into the evolutionary workshop. But they were not the final product. Even as these early prototypes were testing the limits of feathered flight, a new, more refined and ultimately far more successful lineage was taking shape alongside them. These were the first creatures that we, looking back with the clear vision of hindsight, can truly begin to call birds. They emerged in the early Cretaceous period, sharing the skies with their four-winged cousins and the last of the Archaeopteryx-like forms. And while they still bore the unmistakable marks of their dinosaurian ancestry, they had begun to acquire the key features that would define avian success for the next 100 million years. One of the most dominant and diverse groups of these early birds is known to science as the Enantiornithes, a name that means opposite birds. They earned this slightly confusing name due to a subtle difference in the way their shoulder bones fused, a minor anatomical detail compared to modern birds. But in every other meaningful way, they were a dramatic leap forward. Imagine seeing one of these creatures perched on the branch of an ancient conifer. It is small, perhaps the size of a modern sparrow or a robin. It is fully feathered, its wings well formed and capable. But as it opens its mouth to call, you see not a smooth keratin beak, but a jaw still lined with small, sharp reptilian teeth. And as it hops along the branch, you might catch a glimpse of the tiny, sharp claws that still emerge from the front of its wings, a ghostly reminder of the grasping hand of its theropod ancestors. These were the opposite birds. They were a wild success story. The fossil record shows that they exploded in diversity, spreading across the globe, adapting to countless different ecological niches. There were enantiornathes that lived like modern shorebirds, probing the mudflats with long, slender snouts. There were others that were like woodland birds, flitting through the trees. Some even seemed to have been ocean-going, perhaps diving for fish like modern gulls. They had refined the act of flight. Their skeletons were lighter, their breastbones had developed small keels for better muscle attachment, and their tails were becoming shorter, fused into a structure that could support a fan of steering feathers. They were far more agile, more efficient, and more capable flyers than the clumsy flapping of Archaeopteryx. For tens of millions of years, throughout the entire Middle and Late Cretaceous period, they were the undisputed rulers of the avian world. They filled the skies alongside the great, leathery-winged pterosaurs, carving out their own successful niche in the age of dinosaurs. If you had been transported back to the world just before the Great Extinction, you would have seen a sky teeming with these opposite birds. You would have concluded, quite reasonably, that they were the future. They were the successful lineage, the ones destined to inherit the Earth. But evolution had one last, brutal and utterly unpredictable trick up its sleeve. A cosmic accident was about to occur. An event so violent it would reset the entire game. And in the fiery aftermath, these successful, dominant, toothed and claw-winged birds would vanish forever. While another, much quieter, much humbler lineage, a lineage that had been living in their shadow, would suddenly find itself holding the key to an empty world. For 150 million years, the dinosaurs had reigned supreme. From the colossal sauropods that shook the earth to the feathered hunters that were now taking to the skies, they had diversified into an astonishing array of forms, dominating every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. Their world seemed eternal, stable, unchanging. And then, 66 million years ago, on a day that began like any other ordinary day in the late Cretaceous period, the sky itself fell. Somewhere in the vastness of space, an asteroid, a mountain of rock perhaps 6 miles or 10 kilometers wide, had been set on a collision course with Earth billions of years earlier. It traveled silently through the void, unnoticed, until its final, terrible moment. It struck the planet in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The impact was an event of violence so extreme it is almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend. It hit with the force of billions of atomic bombs, vaporizing instantly, along with a vast chunk of the Earth's crust beneath it. The immediate effects were apocalyptic. A fireball, hundreds of miles wide, erupted into the sky, incinerating everything within its reach. Earthquakes, greater than any ever recorded in human history, shook the entire planet, triggering volcanic eruptions and tsunamis that raced across the oceans, washing miles inland. A rain of molten rock, superheated glass ejected from the impact crater, fell back through the atmosphere across the globe, setting the world's forests ablaze. But the true killer was not the initial impact, it was the aftermath. The sheer volume of dust, soot from the global wildfires, and sulfur aerosols blasted high into the stratosphere created a thick, dark shroud that enveloped the entire planet. The sun was blotted out. An impact winter began. Temperatures plummeted. Photosynthesis, the very foundation of almost all life on Earth, shut down. The great forests, which had survived for millions of years, withered and died in the prolonged darkness and cold. For the dinosaurs, this was a catastrophe beyond imagining. The giant herbivores, the triceratops, and the duck-billed hadrosaurs starved first, as the plants they depended upon vanished. And as the herbivores died, the great carnivores, the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex, starved soon after. Their world, their entire food web, had collapsed from the bottom up in a matter of months, or perhaps just a few years. It was a global ecological guillotine. Anything large, anything specialized, anything that depended on a constant supply of fresh vegetation was doomed. And this included the birds. The successful dominant enantiorniths, those opposite birds with their toothed beaks and clawed wings, which had filled the skies for tens of millions of years, were wiped out. Completely. We do not know for certain why they failed, but perhaps their reliance on the same forest ecosystems as their larger dinosaur cousins, or perhaps their still primitive metabolisms, left them unable to cope with the prolonged darkness and starvation. The age of dinosaurs, in its grand classical sense, was over. The titans were gone. The great dynasty had fallen. The world was plunged into a dark, cold silence. But in this silence, in the ash-covered ruins of the old world, something small, something humble, and something incredibly resilient had somehow, against all odds, managed to survive. It was not a giant. It was not a specialist. It was a creature that had been living quietly in the shadows, and it possessed a set of adaptations that, purely by chance, turned out to be the perfect toolkit for surviving the end of the world. The world was broken. The skies were dark, the air was cold, and the great forests that had defined the age of dinosaurs were now fields of ash and skeletal burnt trunks. The rulers of the planet, the magnificent dinosaurs that had reigned for 150 million years, were gone. The successful, diverse and abundant opposite birds, the enantiorniths, had vanished with them. The extinction was a brutal, indiscriminate filter, a planetary reset that seemed to spare almost nothing large or specialized. And yet, something did survive. A lineage of birds, small, humble, and previously living in the shadow of their more dominant cousins, somehow passed through this global bottleneck. These were the ancestors of every single bird alive on Earth today. They belonged to the group we call the Neornithes, the new birds. How did they do it? Why did this one specific group make it through the fire, the darkness, and the starvation when their seemingly more successful relatives did not? The answer lies not in a single magic bullet, but in a combination of fortunate traits, a perfect toolkit for surviving the end of the world. Traits that had likely evolved for entirely different reasons, but which, purely by chance, turned out to be life-saving adaptations in the face of apocalypse. The first, and perhaps most crucial advantage, was simply size. The birds that survived were, almost without exception, small. We are talking about creatures the size of a modern quail or a sparrow. In a world where the entire food web had collapsed, being small was a profound advantage. A small body requires far less food to sustain itself. It can survive on scraps, on the tiny remnants of a broken ecosystem, and a small body can hide. It can burrow into the ground, take shelter in crevices, or find refuge in the damp undergrowth, escaping the worst of the initial devastation and the lingering, toxic environment. While the giants were exposed and starving, the small could endure. The second key was their diet. The birds that made it through seemed to have been generalists, or specialists in food sources that were less affected by the initial catastrophe. While the enantiorniths, like their larger dinosaur cousins, may have depended heavily on the fruits, insects, and small vertebrates of the living forest, the survivors likely had a different menu. Many scientists believe that the crucial adaptation was the ability to eat seeds. Seeds are nature's perfect survival capsule. They are packed with energy, and they can lie dormant in the soil for years, waiting for conditions to improve. In a world where all fresh vegetation had died, the soil itself became a vast, hidden pantry, filled with the seeds of the plants that had come before. And this leads directly to the third crucial advantage: the beak. Unlike the toothed enantiorniths, the ancestors of modern birds had already lost their teeth and evolved a true keratinous beak. And a beak is a far superior tool for processing seeds than a mouthful of sharp, reptilian teeth. It can crack, crush, and manipulate small, hard objects with a precision that a toothed jaw cannot match. The beak, which likely evolved for other reasons entirely, became the perfect key to unlocking the hidden post-apocalyptic seed bank. Other factors may have played a role. Perhaps these surviving birds nested on the ground rather than in trees, making them less dependent on the forests that had vanished. Perhaps they had faster growth rates, able to reach maturity and reproduce quickly in the brief windows of opportunity that the devastated world offered. Perhaps their already advanced warm-blooded metabolism gave them an edge in the cold, impact winter. We may never know the exact combination of traits that spelled the difference between survival and extinction. But the result is undeniable. The filter was brutally effective. It wiped out the giants. It wiped out the specialists. It wiped out the toothed, clawed birds of the old world. And it left behind only the small, the generalist, the seed-eating, the beaked, the new birds. They had inherited a planet that was empty, scarred, and silent. But it was theirs. The age of reptiles was truly over. The age of mammals and the age of birds was about to begin. The silence that fell upon the earth after the Great Impact was a silence unlike any that had been heard for 150 million years. The thunderous footsteps of the giants were gone. The rustle of vast fern forests was replaced by the whisper of wind across ash-covered plains. The skies, once filled with the leathery wings of pterosaurs and the buzzing flocks of enantiorniths, were now vast, open, and hauntingly empty. But this silence was not the silence of death. It was the silence of a held breath. It was the quiet before the storm. The apocalypse had been a brutal, indiscriminate reset, a fire that had burned the old world down to its foundations. But from those foundations, life, resilient and irrepressible, was already beginning to stir. And the creatures that were poised to inherit this new, empty world were the ones who had passed through the filter, the small, the seed-eating, the beaked, the new birds, the neonithes. For millions of years, they had lived in the shadows, a minor chord in the great symphony of the Mesozoic. They were small, ground-dwelling, perhaps wading birds, occupying the ecological niches that their larger, more dominant dinosaur cousins had left vacant. But now, those cousins were gone. The giants were gone. The competition was gone. The predators were gone. They had inherited a planet that was, ecologically speaking, a blank slate. Imagine a world full of empty jobs. An entire planet's worth of ecological niches, the role of the treetop browser, the role of the shoreline predator, the role of the night-flying hunter, were suddenly, simultaneously, vacant. It was the greatest evolutionary opportunity in the history of vertebrate life. And the birds seized it. With ferocious, explosive, evolutionary speed. This period, in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, is known as an adaptive radiation. It is a moment when a single ancestral lineage finds itself in a world of abundant resources and zero competition, and it literally explodes, diversifying into thousands of new forms, each one adapting to fill one of those empty jobs. The small, quail-like survivors began to change. Freed from the constraints of living in a world ruled by giant predators, some began to lose their ability to fly altogether and instead grew large. Very large. This was the birth of the ratites, the ostriches of Africa, the emus of Australia, the rheas of South America, and the extinct moa of New Zealand and elephant birds of Madagascar. They became the new giant herbivores of a world without dinosaurs. Others took to the water, some evolved into powerful swimmers, pursuing fish in the newly emptied oceans. This lineage would lead to the penguins, trading the sky for the sea, their wings becoming powerful, flipper-like paddles. Others became the new predators of the night. Their eyes grew large, their feathers softened for silent flight, and their hearing became uncannily acute. This was the birth of the owls, reclaiming the darkness that had once belonged to the small theropods, and the vast majority simply took back the sky. Their flight became stronger, more agile, more efficient. Their beaks diversified into 1,000 different tools, sharp hooks for tearing meat, long probes for finding insects, thick crackers for seeds, delicate sips for nectar. Their feet adapted to perching on branches that no longer held dinosaurs, to wading in shorelines free of marine reptiles, to grasping prey that no longer needed to fear the shadow of a pterosaur. Within just a few million years, a geological blink of an eye, the quiet, humble survivors of the apocalypse had transformed themselves into the astonishing, vibrant, and noisy avian world we know today. Parrots, eagles, hummingbirds, sparrows, ducks, woodpeckers, all of them are the direct descendants of those few, small, seed-eating creatures that somehow found a way to scratch out a living in the ruins of the Cretaceous. The explosion was breathtaking. The silence was broken. The world was filled, once again, with the sound of wings and with a new kind of song. The dinosaurs were gone, but their children, smaller, faster, feathered, and infinitely more adaptable, had inherited the Earth. And so, we arrive back in our own time. We have traveled across an immense ocean of 150 million years, from the fern-covered floor of a Jurassic forest, through the crucible of a global apocalypse, and into the vibrant, noisy world of today. And the revelation that this journey delivers is simple, profound, and beautifully disruptive. The dinosaurs never truly left. They are not just the inspiration for movie monsters. They are not just the magnificent fossilized skeletons that fill our museum halls. They are alive. They are diverse. And they are everywhere. We simply call them by a different name. We call them birds. This is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic flourish. It is a literal, biological, and evolutionary fact. Birds are dinosaurs. They are a living, breathing branch of the exact same family tree that included Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor. They are the small, feathered, flying theropods that survived. The evidence is now so overwhelming, so complete, that it is the scientific consensus. The revolution that began with that fuzzy Sinosauropteryx fossil in China is now the accepted truth. Look closely at the next bird you see. Look beyond the familiar image and try to see the dinosaur within. See the scales on its legs and feet. Those are not an accident. They are a direct physical inheritance from its reptilian ancestors, a tiny, lingering echo of the scaly skin that once covered its entire body. Feel the lightness of its bones if you were ever to hold one. That hollow pneumatic structure is not a bird invention. It is the ancient breathing system of a T-Rex, repurposed for flight. Watch a chicken peck at the ground, its head bobbing back and forth. That distinctive head-bobbing gait. It is the same way that paleontologists believe many small theropods walked, a mechanism for stabilizing their vision as they moved. See the way a bird tucks its head under its wing when it sleeps. That is the exact posture of the Mei Long, the sleeping dragon, captured forever in stone. Think of the wishbone you find in your holiday Turkey. That is the same V-shaped fused clavicle that braced the chest of an Allosaurus as it grappled with its prey. And the feathers themselves, those intricate, beautiful, and complex structures, are the final, undeniable proof. They are not analogous to scales. They are evolved scales, a direct lineage traced back through fossils like Archaeopteryx and Caudipteryx, all the way to that simple, insulating dino fuzz. Even their behavior whispers of their ancient heritage. The way a bird builds a nest, carefully incubating its hard-shelled eggs, protecting its young. This is parental care, a behavior we now know from fossil evidence was practiced by many dinosaurs. When a sparrow lands on your windowsill, you are not just seeing a small, familiar creature. You are seeing a living dinosaur, a tiny, feathered echo of the Mesozoic. When a hawk circles high overhead, its keen eyes scanning the ground, you are seeing the direct descendant of a lineage of apex predators that ruled the earth for longer than mammals have even existed. The dinosaurs did not vanish in a fiery apocalypse. One branch of their magnificent family tree learned a new trick. They learned to fly. They learned to survive. And in doing so, they inherited the earth, transforming themselves into the 10,000 different species of birds that fill our skies, our forests, and our gardens today. The story is not one of extinction, it is one of glorious, improbable, and feathered survival. And so, our long flight through 150 million years of history comes gently to a close. We have witnessed the slow, accidental assembly of a flying machine. We have seen scales transform into feathers, arms into wings, and a fierce, ground-dwelling predator into the ancestor of the robin that sings outside your window. The story of how dinosaurs became birds is not just a scientific explanation. It is an epic poem written in the language of bone and feather across an immense ocean of time. It is a story that teaches us about the beautiful, unpredictable, and often deeply ironic nature of evolution. Nothing in this tale was planned. Nothing was inevitable. Flight was not a goal that life was striving towards. It was a magnificent accident, a beautiful consequence born from a series of solutions to entirely different problems. Feathers evolved for warmth and then for beauty. Hollow bones evolved for breathing. The wishbone evolved for strength. The swiveling wrist evolved for hunting. And yet, when these separate, unrelated pieces finally came together, they created something entirely new, something magical, the power of flight. It is a testament to the idea that the grandest transformations often begin with the humblest of origins. This journey also reshapes our own place in the grand narrative of life. We, as mammals, spent 100 million years living in the shadows of the dinosaurs, small nocturnal creatures scurrying beneath their feet. We inherited the earth only after they were gone. But the birds, they are the dinosaurs. They are not successors. They are survivors. They are a direct, unbroken lineage, a living thread stretching all the way back to the heart of the Mesozoic. In a very real sense, the age of dinosaurs never truly ended. It simply learned to fly and shrunk and learned to sing. So the next time you look up and see a bird tracing a silent arc across the vast blue canvas of the sky, perhaps you will see it differently. See beyond the familiar form. See the ghost of the theropod within. See the echo of Archaeopteryx in the angle of its wing, the shadow of May long in the curve of its sleeping posture, the glint of Velociraptor in the keenness of its eye. You are watching a small piece of prehistoric life, perfectly adapted, thriving in our modern world. You are watching a creature whose ancestors walked with giants, survived the apocalypse, and inherited the earth. You are watching a living dinosaur. And perhaps, in that moment of recognition, the immense, silent depths of deep time will feel just a little bit closer. the great lost world of the dinosaurs will feel not quite so lost, and the quiet, feathered miracle that flits past your window will seem, for a moment, like the most extraordinary creature on Earth. Because, in a way, it truly is. It is the feathered legacy of a world we can only dream of.